By the end of the 13th century, Europe had lost all of its possessions in the Holy Land. Once mighty castles of the Crusaders stood in ruins, and ships hurriedly sailed away from the ports of Acre and Tyre. Those who had triumphantly entered Jerusalem under crosses and banners now left the East forever, but it had all begun very differently. 2 centuries earlier, people believed that the cross upon their chests could open the gates of heaven. They left their homes, their fields, and their families to embark on the greatest military adventure of the Middle Ages. It was an age that would transform not only Europe, but the entire world. Tonight, we will journey through the history of the Crusades, from the first call of Pope Urban II to the fall of the last strongholds in the Holy Land. We will pass through victories and defeats, through fanatical faith and unmeasured cruelty, through the wealth of trade and the ruins of cities. If you enjoy exploring great processes of the past in a calm, reflective atmosphere, consider subscribing to this channel. More stories are yet to come, tales that will help you fall asleep, but will also linger in memory. The late 11th century. Europe was a land of feudal castles, small principalities, and endless wars. The lives of most people were bound to heavy labor on the land and obedience to their local lords. Roads were dangerous, towns were small, and royal authority was often weak and uncertain. Yet despite this fragmentation, one thing united all Europeans: faith. Christianity was not only a religion, it was a foundation of society, the rhythm of time that shaped every day. Feasts, liturgies, and pilgrimages gave people a sense of belonging to something greater than their own village or town. At the center of the spiritual map of the world lay the Holy Land, Jerusalem, Bethlehem, Nazareth, the very places where Christ himself was believed to have walked. For pilgrims, this was the highest goal and dream, to see with their own eyes the land where their faith began. The road was long and dangerous, but anyone who returned was honored as a hero in their community. By the second half of the 11th century, however, this sacred land had fallen under control of the Seljuk Turks. Pilgrimages became increasingly difficult. There were attacks, restrictions, and persecutions. For Christian Europe, this was a deep shock. At the same time, the authority of the papacy was rising in the heart of Europe. The Pope of Rome sought not only spiritual, but also political leadership. The Church saw how divided kingdoms were consumed by feudal wars and needed an idea strong enough to unite them under one banner. That idea came in the year 1095, when Pope Urban II addressed a crowd in the city of Clermont in France. He called on all Christians, from kings and knights to peasants and beggars, to set out for the Holy Land and liberate the Holy Sepulchre from the infidels. His words fell on fertile ground. Europe lived in fear of sin and the afterlife, and the Pope's promise that participation in the crusade would bring full remission of sins was extraordinarily powerful. For a knight, it meant a chance for glory and land. For a peasant, it was a way to escape poverty. And for the Church, it was a chance to display its power. Thus began a new age, the age of the Crusades. An age where faith and violence, fanaticism and ambition intertwined in a grand process that would shape the face of the Middle Ages. When we speak of the First Crusade, most imagine knights in heavy armor, bearing banners and shields marked with the cross. But before kings and organized armies set out, Europe was swept by another wave, the movement known as the People's Crusade. This came even before the official armies were assembled. Thousands of ordinary people, peasants, craftsmen, beggars, even children, rushed to the road, believing that Pope Urban II's call was meant for them as well. They did not wait for royal commands or knightly summons. They set out on their own. The most famous among their leaders was Peter the Hermit, a small, gaunt monk in a rough robe whose fiery words stirred hearts. He preached that the Holy Land was calling, that anyone who bore the cross would gain salvation. People listened and believed. The crowds marched through France and the German lands. Their columns stretched for miles. They had no war horses or true armor. Some carried old hunting bows, others rusty farm scythes. Many bore only wooden staffs and rough-hewn crosses. Women walked alongside men. Children clutched their parents' hands. It was more a vast pilgrimage than an army. Yet this movement had a darker side. As they passed through German cities, mobs of zealots turned their anger upon Jewish communities. In Worms, Mainz, and Cologne, massacres erupted. Thousands of the defenseless were killed. For many participants, this seemed part of their holy mission. In truth, it was the first sign that faith, when mixed with fear and hatred, could bring only blood. When the masses reached Constantinople, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos did not see a disciplined army, but a starving and unruly tide of humanity. He distrusted them, yet could not stop them, wishing to rid his lands of this chaos. He quickly ferried them across the Bosporus. On the other side, the Seljuk Turks awaited. Lacking true commanders and discipline, the crowds of peasants and zealots could not stand against experienced soldiers. The battles were brief and brutal. Thousands were slaughtered, others taken into slavery. Thus ended the People's Crusade, the first wave of enthusiasm that preceded the First Crusade. It showed how powerful the faith of common people could be, and at the same time, how destructive unbridled fanaticism without leadership would become. Ahead marched the knights and kings, those who would form the true army of the First Crusade. Their long road to the Holy Land was only beginning. After the tragic collapse of the People's Crusade, Europe did not abandon its idea. On the contrary, the enthusiasm only grew stronger. This time, it was not hungry peasants who set out, but organized knightly armies, prepared for war. Under the banners of the cross gathered some of the most renowned lords of the age. There was no single king or emperor to lead this movement. Instead, it was a coalition of princes and counts. Among them were Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, Bohemond of Taranto, Duke Robert of Normandy, and others. Each had his own ambitions, but they were united by faith and by the Pope's call. In 1096, the great host began its march, heading toward Constantinople. Their journey was long and difficult. Armies moved along different routes, through Hungary, the Balkans, Italy, and some by sea. In every city, they were met with suspicion. For the locals, they were strangers, vast, armed multitudes demanding food and supplies. When the Crusaders finally reached Constantinople, Emperor Alexios I Komnenos regarded them with caution. He remembered the chaos brought by the people's bands, and now tens of thousands of armed warriors stood before his gates. The emperor needed help against the Turks, yet he feared losing control. He therefore required the Crusader leaders to swear an oath. All lands taken from the Turks would be returned to the empire. After tense negotiations, the armies were ferried across the Bosporus. There, in Asia Minor, awaited their first true trials. In 1097, the Crusaders came to Nicaea, a strong fortress of the Seljuks. The siege lasted weeks. The knights built towers and engines, while the Turks launched desperate sorties. In the end, the city surrendered, but not to the Crusaders themselves. Instead, through secret negotiation, it was handed over directly to the Byzantines. This caused suspicion and resentment among the allies. Further south, the march continued. In July 1097, the Crusaders met the Turks at the Battle of Dorylaeum. The Turkish cavalry struck fiercely at Bohemon's vanguard, and for hours it seemed the Crusaders would be destroyed. Only the timely arrival of reinforcements saved them. The battle was savage, but here the heavy cavalry of Europe showed its terrifying power, breaking even the seasoned Turkish horsemen. After Dorylaeum, the army pressed deeper into Anatolia. The road was grueling. Burning heat, hunger, thirst, and constant ambushes. Yet in 1098, they reached one of the greatest cities of Syria, Antioch. The siege of Antioch became a trial by fire. The city's walls were massive, while the Crusaders lacked the numbers for a swift assault. Month after month passed. The army suffered from famine, disease, and the bitter cold of winter nights. Horses were eaten, weeds pulled from the ground for food. Many despaired, believing God had abandoned them. But in June 1098, the city fell. Through the betrayal of a guard, the Crusaders gained entry and opened the gates. Antioch was taken. Yet almost immediately, a far greater Turkish army surrounded the city. The besiegers became the besieged. What followed was a struggle for survival. Then came a sign, the discovery of the Holy Lance, the spear said to have pierced the side of Christ. This relic ignited the army's faith, and with renewed courage, they charged against their enemies. Against all odds, the Turks were driven back, and Antioch remained in Crusader hands. Still, the cost was immense. The Crusaders were weary, starving, and divided, yet their eyes were fixed on a single goal. Ahead of them lay Jerusalem, and the road to the Holy City was only beginning. After the exhausting siege of Antioch, the Crusaders were weakened. Thousands had perished, and many abandoned the march, worn down by hunger and despair. Yet those who remained could not turn back. Ahead lay the goal for which they had left their homes and crossed continents, Jerusalem. The journey from Antioch to the Holy Land led across the burning plains of Syria and the rocky roads of Palestine. What had once been a vast host was now reduced to only tens of thousands. They marched in rags, weary and ill, yet driven by unshakable determination. Every cross carved on a village church, every prayer spoken by local Christians renewed their strength. At last, in June 1099, the Holy City appeared before their eyes, Jerusalem. For pilgrims, knights, and peasants alike, it was the heart of their faith, the place where Christ had suffered and risen. To see it was a dream, to hold it was their mission. But Jerusalem was not easily taken. At that time, it lay under the rule of the Fatimid Caliphate, and its defenses were formidable. High walls crowned the hills, gates were fortified, and supplies of food and water were stored for a long resistance. The Crusaders, by contrast, were exhausted. They suffered terribly under the summer sun. Wells had been destroyed or poisoned, water was scarce, and men and horses alike collapsed on the dry earth. In the midst of despair, the leaders called for prayer and fasting. In July 1099, barefoot and chanting psalms, the Crusaders held a solemn procession around the city walls, begging God for aid. Even the defenders on the ramparts were said to have been struck by the sight. Soon, preparations began for the final assault, with little wood available nearby. Soldiers dismantled shelters and searched far and wide for timber to build towers and rams. Every plank carried beneath the blazing sky was a step toward their goal. On the morning of July 15, 1099, the assault began. Great siege towers creaked forward. Shields and banners gleamed in the sun. From the walls, defenders rained arrows, stones, and fire upon them. Trumpets sounded, voices roared, and the dust of battle rose over the plain. The fighting was fierce and desperate. Yet by midday, one of the great towers touched the walls. Crusaders climbed, ladders were raised, and knights pressed forward. Godfrey of Bouillon himself directed the attack. Inch by inch, the Crusaders gained ground until they broke through and the walls were theirs. Jerusalem had fallen. The chronicles tell us that the entry into the city was accompanied by great suffering and loss of life among its inhabitants. For the victors it was triumph, but for many others it was tragedy. The memory of that day remained deeply etched in both East and West, shaping relations for centuries to come. Yet for the Crusaders, this was the moment of fulfillment. They knelt at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, shedding tears of relief and awe. Their journey, begun in distant lands, had brought them at last to the heart of their faith. Godfrey of Bouillon, was acclaimed as a defender of the Holy Sepulchre. He refused the title of king, declaring that he would not wear a golden crown in the city where Christ had worn one of thorns. Thus was founded the Kingdom of Jerusalem, a new Crusader state in the east. But victory was only the beginning. To conquer was one thing. To hold the Holy Land would prove far more difficult. And so, the struggle was destined to continue for nearly 2 centuries more. After the fall of Jerusalem in July 1099, the Crusaders felt that they had reached the height of their mission. They entered the holy city, wept in the church of the Holy Sepulchre, and prayed along the streets that they believed had once borne the steps of Christ. Yet a question immediately arose: what would come next? They could not simply return home. The Holy Land had to be not only conquered, but also held. Thus was born the Kingdom of Jerusalem. Its first ruler was Godfrey of Bouillon, yet he refused the title of king. In his mind, in the city where the Savior had worn a crown of thorns, no man should wear a crown of gold. Instead, he took the title of Defender of the Holy Sepulchre. It was a symbol that authority here was not merely political, but profoundly spiritual. The kingdom embraced not only Jerusalem itself, but much of Palestine, coastal towns, fortresses, and lands of great strategic value. Yet in truth, this new state was fragile. Its population was overwhelmingly local: Arabs, Syrians, Armenians, and Greeks. The European knights and settlers were only a small minority. Within Jerusalem, cultures mingled constantly. In the narrow streets, one could hear many tongues: Latin, Greek, Arabic, Armenian. The markets offered spices and silks, weapons and oil, fruit and bread. Pilgrims came from Europe in growing numbers, now able to visit the holy places under protection of the new kingdom. But with pilgrims came soldiers, for defense was always uncertain. All around lay powerful Muslim states that would never accept the loss of Jerusalem. From the very beginning, the kingdom needed strong walls. The Crusaders rebuilt and fortified castles. Old strongholds were turned into mighty citadels. Towers rose above the hills. Fortresses crowned the roads and mountain passes. One such symbol was Croix des Chevaliers, the massive stronghold that still stands today, a reminder of that age. At the heart of the capital stood the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, restored and adorned. It became not only a place of worship, but the beating heart of the kingdom itself. Ceremonies were held within its walls. Pilgrims gathered at its altars, and in time, kings of Jerusalem would be enthroned there. Life in this new state was never easy. Knights from the cold climates of Europe now had to endure the searing heat, strange illnesses, and unfamiliar customs. Some married local women. Some adapted their diets and clothing, and in time, a new hybrid culture emerged, what came to be called the Latin East. Yet danger was never far. Every town had to be garrisoned, every road patrolled. Every year brought the threat of siege or attack. Victories were always followed by fresh challenges, for the kingdom was a small island of Latin Christendom in a vast sea of rivals. Still, the kingdom of Jerusalem endured for nearly a century. It became the symbol of the Crusader presence in the East. Fragile though it was and dependent on support from Europe, it stood as the heart and soul of all later Crusades. For as long as Jerusalem was held, the idea of holy war lived on, calling new generations to the East. After the founding of the Kingdom of Jerusalem, the land became not only a military outpost, but also a home for those who had left distant Europe. Here lived men and women who believed they now stood at the very heart of the world, in the place where heaven touched the earth. Each year, pilgrims arrived in Jerusalem from across Europe. The road was long and perilous, yet now they could walk to the holy sites under protection of the Crusaders. The narrow streets of the city echoed with many tongues. Latin mingled with French, German, Greek, and Arabic. Pilgrims brought offerings, purchased relics, and left alms. For them, To touch the stones of the Holy Sepulchre was to touch eternity itself. The knights who remained in the Holy Land lived very differently from those in their European castles. Here, every day could be their last. They wore armor beneath the burning sun, trained in dusty yards, and kept watch on the walls. Some were granted fortresses that guarded roads and valleys. It was in this land that the great military orders began to take shape. The Hospitallers, who had first cared for sick pilgrims, became warrior monks. The Templars, who settled near the former Temple of Solomon, swore to defend all travelers. They grew into a powerful force, uniting prayer with the discipline of arms. Jerusalem itself was a meeting place of cultures. In its markets, Syrian merchants, Armenian craftsmen, and Italian traders sold their goods side by side. Olive oil, spices, fine textiles, glassware, fruits, and wine all found their place on the stalls. Europeans discovered new flavors and customs, rice, citrus fruits, and unfamiliar seasonings. They slowly learned to live in a new climate and in a world both foreign and strangely familiar. Houses were built with thick walls to keep out the heat. Clothing was lighter than in Europe, and local produce filled their tables. Some even adopted daily customs from the native inhabitants. In time, a unique culture emerged where Latin hymns blended with Arabic melodies and nightly traditions mingled with Eastern ways. But danger was never far. Beyond the city walls lay a world of enemies. Roads became places of ambush. Fortresses stood ever ready for attack. Farmers went to their fields with weapons at hand. No harvest was secure, for each season carried the shadow of war. At the heart of the kingdom stood the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Its candles burned by day and by night. Coronations and solemn liturgies were held within its walls. Pilgrims from every land gathered there, seeking answers in prayer. For many, this was a reason to remain in the Holy Land despite its perils. The kingdom of Jerusalem was fragile, yet it endured. It became a bridge between West and East, a meeting place of cultures, and at the same time a land of ceaseless struggle. Here faith and daily labor mingled with hope and fear, and the attempt to build a new world upon foreign soil lasted nearly a century. The First Crusade ended in triumph for the Crusaders. Against all odds, they marched thousands of miles through hostile lands, endured hunger, disease, and countless battles, and yet they reached Jerusalem and took the holy city. Out of what had begun as a desperate adventure, a new political reality was born. On the lands conquered by the warriors of the cross, several new states were established. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Edessa, and the County of Tripoli. These became footholds of the Latin world in the East, fragile in strength, yet symbolically powerful. In Europe, the news of Jerusalem's capture brought waves of joy and awe. Hymns of thanksgiving were sung in monasteries and cathedrals, while in villages and towns people spoke of miracles and victories. To many, it seemed a sign of divine favor. Pilgrims began traveling east in ever greater numbers, and the Holy Land became not only a military conquest, but a spiritual destination. Yet even in the moment of victory, the shadows of future troubles were already clear. The Latin states were surrounded by powerful Muslim neighbors. They depended on aid from Europe, on new waves of warriors willing to cross the seas. They were far from home, and every fortress, every city, could at any time become a battlefield. Such was the conclusion of the First Crusade, a brilliant victory that at the same time opened the door to new dangers and trials. The Crusaders had won Jerusalem, but now a greater task remained, to hold it, and that struggle would continue for generations to come. While the Kingdom of Jerusalem struggled to take root in a foreign land, a new challenge was quietly rising in the West. Decades had passed since the triumph of the First Crusade, and the world seemed to be adjusting to the presence of Crusader states in the East. Yet the balance of power was shifting, and in the year 1144 a blow fell that shook the Christian West. The fall of the County of Edessa, Edessa was one of the most remote and vulnerable Latin possessions, lying far to the northeast of the main Crusader strongholds. It had been established in the early years of the Crusades as a frontier outpost, a shield, and a reflection of local ambition. But its stability was fragile. When Muslim forces united and advanced, Edessa could not withstand the pressure. Its fall sent waves of alarm across Christendom. If such a county could be lost, could the greater states of the East survive? In response, Pope Eugenius III issued a call for a new crusade. He was not the fiery preacher that Urban II had been, but this movement soon found another voice. Bernard Clairvaux, a saintly and charismatic monk whose sermons stirred knights and kings alike. Bernard spoke of the moral duty to support Christian brothers in the East, of the obligation to protect pilgrims, and of the eternal reward promised to those who took the cross for a second time. This call reached the highest thrones of Europe. Two monarchs themselves, Conrad III of Germany and Louis VII of France, pledged to lead the crusade. Their commitment gave the effort a weight and dignity it had never before possessed. This was no longer a venture of scattered lords, but an official campaign led by kings. Preparation spread across Europe. Thousands once again set aside their daily lives, sold their goods, and said farewells to family and land. In monasteries, psalms were chanted and vows spoken. Knights repaired their armor. Smiths forged weapons, and provisions were gathered. Hope mingled with anxiety, for memories of past disasters haunted many. The two kings chose different routes. Conrad III gathered his forces and marched through Central Europe to Byzantium, then crossed the Bosporus into Anatolia. His army soon felt the strain of the journey. Mountain passes, dry plains, scarce water. Coordination was difficult. Supplies uncertain and danger ever present. Louis VII chose another way, traveling through Italy and sailing by sea toward the eastern Mediterranean. The voyage carried its own perils. Storms, shortages, and tense dealings with the Byzantine Empire. The emperor, remembering the chaos of earlier Crusaders, received these vast new hosts with suspicion. The harshest test came in Anatolia. There, the open plains and rugged hills favored swift Turkish cavalry. European heavy knights, so powerful in their own lands, struggled in a terrain that offered them little advantage. At Nicaea at Dorylaeum, Conrad's forces suffered defeat. His army was shattered, many slain, and others fled in disorder. It was a bitter lesson that Western tactics did not always prevail in the East. The Crusader host faced not only battle but hunger, thirst, and disease. Far from home, with long supply lines and uncertain allies, every mile drained their strength. Men fell ill, morale withered, and the shining hope of swift victory grew dim. When at last the German and French armies met in Syria, they were shadows of their former selves. The proud ranks that had marched out of Europe were now weary and diminished. The Crusaders learned once more that crowns and titles did not guarantee triumph in distant wars. Success required strategy, supply, and an understanding of the land they marched through. Yet hopes lingered. Leaders sought alliances, spoke of new plans, and dreamed of renewed glory. They knew that for the Second Crusade to matter, it had to achieve something bold. And so, despite the setbacks of Anatolia, all eyes turned toward Damascus, the city that would test the very heart of their endeavor. After the heavy losses in Anatolia, the armies of the kings at last reached Syria. Here, on lands already familiar with the Crusaders' presence, they sought a goal worthy of their sacrifice. Their eyes turned toward Damascus, a great city rich in gardens and markets, and a key to power in the region. Damascus held both strategic and symbolic weight. To capture it would strengthen the Crusaders' hold on the Holy Land and secure their fragile states. And so, in the summer of 1148, the combined armies of Europe marched to lay siege to the city. At first, success seemed near. The Crusaders set their camp among the fertile orchards west of Damascus, where water flowed through channels and trees offered shade. After weeks of hardship, this place gave them strength, and the first assaults pressed close to the walls. But Damascus was ready. Its defenders launched counterattacks, showered arrows and stones from the battlements, and destroyed siege engines. Every street inside the city was prepared for defense, and even had the Crusaders broken through, they would have faced bitter fighting within the walls. Then hesitation struck the Allied leaders. Some argued the attack should shift to another side of the city. The armies moved from the orchards to barren ground with little water or cover. This change proved disastrous. Morale crumbled. Whispers of treachery spread. Some said local alliances made the siege unwinnable. Others blamed rivalry among the Crusader lords. Food grew scarce. Arguments multiplied, and the unity of the host dissolved. On the fourth day, the decision was made to withdraw. The Crusaders abandoned their lines and marched away from the city. For many, it was a moment of humiliation. An army led by kings had failed to capture its prize. News of the failure raced across Christendom. In Europe it brought shock and sorrow. Bernard of Clairvaux, who had preached the crusade with such passion, now struggled to explain the defeat. He called it a trial sent by God, insisting that the fault lay not in the holy cause but in the sins of men. Yet such words brought little comfort for the Muslim world. The retreat at Damascus was a sign of hope. It proved that the Crusaders could be resisted and even defeated. Confidence grew, and new leaders would soon rise, ready to challenge the Latin states more fiercely than ever before. The Second Crusade ended without conquest, leaving bitterness in Europe and emboldening the East. Where the First Crusade had ended in triumph, the Second ended in disappointment. It revealed that faith and zeal alone could not guarantee success. Strategy, unity, and foresight would be needed for the struggles to come. But the story of the Crusades was far from over. Ahead lay new figures, new battles, and new tides of history that would reshape the map of the Middle East for generations. After the failure of the Second Crusade, Europe's hopes for swift victories faded. The Latin states in the East were left to stand on their own. They endured. Fortresses still held. Pilgrims still journeyed to Jerusalem. But the sense of security was gone. The Crusader kingdoms were surrounded, and every ruler knew his power was fragile, his borders uncertain. Decades passed, and in the Muslim world, a new force was rising. Where once the East had been divided among many rulers and dynasties, lands were now being gathered under a single name, the name of Saladin. Saladin was born of Kurdish origin, and his early life gave no sign of the destiny that awaited him. Serving first under his uncle, he rose through the ranks, and his skill as both general and statesman soon set him apart. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was not only a man of battle, but also a man of vision of unity. By the late 1170s, Saladin had become Sultan of both Egypt and Syria. Under his command, vast territories were joined together, and this meant that the Crusader states now faced not scattered lords, but a single, powerful empire. In 1187 came the turning point. The Crusader army met Saladin near the hills of Atin. The battle ended in disaster for the Latin forces. Almost the entire army of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was destroyed or taken captive. Soon afterward, the holy city itself fell. Jerusalem was once more in Muslim hands. The news swept across Europe like a storm. The loss of Jerusalem was almost beyond belief. The city that had been won with such sacrifice in the First Crusade was gone. Bells tolled in monasteries and cathedrals, and chroniclers wrote that Christendom wept. Out of this grief came a new call. The Pope proclaimed the need for a third crusade. And this time it would not be mere counts and dukes who took the cross, but the greatest monarchs of the West, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip II of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany. Thus began a new chapter, filled with great battles, fragile truces, and the legendary encounter of two towering figures, Saladin and Richard, whose rivalry would echo through memory of both East and West. When news of Jerusalem's fall in 1187 reached Europe, it struck like an earthquake. Bells tolled in monasteries and cathedrals. Chroniclers wrote of dark times, and many believed the end of the world was near. For the holy city, the very heart of Christian faith, was once again in the hands of the Muslims. The Pope's call for a new crusade reached the greatest monarchs of the age. 3 kings took the cross: Frederick Barbarossa, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire; Philip II Augustus, King of France; and Richard I of Lionheart, King of England. Never before had such figures marched together under the same cause. Frederick Barbarossa was already an old man, but his name commanded respect across Europe. He had fought countless wars, and the army he gathered in Germany was one of the strongest of the age. In 1189, he set out by land, retracing the route of the First Crusaders through the Balkans and into Asia Minor. His march was steady and powerful, and even his enemies respected the might of the aging emperor. But fate was cruel. In 1190, as the army crossed Anatolia, Barbarossa drowned while attempting to ford the river Salif in Cilicia. His death was a devastating blow. The great host broke apart. Some returned home in despair. Others continued, but only a small remnant reached the Holy Land, and without their emperor their strength was greatly diminished. Meanwhile, the other 2 kings, Philip II and Richard the Lionheart, chose the sea. In 1190, they departed from the ports of Marseille and Genoa, leading vast fleets of ships filled with soldiers, supplies, and arms. It was a magnificent sight. Hundreds of sails stretched across the sea, the sound of trumpets echoing along the shores. Richard and Philip were allies, yet rivals as well. Each sought not only to recover the Holy Land, but also to win glory for himself and his kingdom. Their tension was felt even in preparation. Those circumstances forced them to march side by side. The sea voyage was long and perilous. Storms scattered their fleets. Disease swept through crews, and the lack of food and water tested their resolve. Still, the kings pressed on, each mile carrying them closer to the land where destiny awaited. Their first great stop was the island of Cyprus. In 1191, Richard seized it, transforming the island into a vital base for Crusaders. Cyprus would serve as a center of supply and a safe harbor for ships bound for Palestine, a prize that would prove crucial for years to come. Ahead lay Acre, the city that would become the opening stage of the Third Crusade, and the place where the armies of Europe would first meet the forces of Saladin. When the armies of Philip II and Richard the Lionheart arrived on the shores of Palestine, their first great challenge was the siege of Acre. The city held immense importance, a port through which trade, troops, and supplies passed. Whoever controlled Acre held the key to the Holy Land. The siege had already begun before the kings arrived. Crusader forces, survivors of Athene, had surrounded the city but struggled to break its defenses. With the arrival of the European monarchs, the effort grew to an unprecedented scale. Encampments stretched across the coastline. By day, trumpets summoned men to battle. By night, hundreds of fires lit the horizon. Disease and hunger struck, yet more pilgrims and soldiers continued to arrive. Over all of it hung the tension between Richard and Philip. Allies in cause, rivals in ambition. Richard, though suffering from illness, personally led assaults. His courage and determination lifted the spirits of his men. Philip too fought with resolve, yet his relationship with Richard was marked by rivalry. Each sought to be remembered as the true champion of the crusade. At last, in July 1191, Acre fell. The city opened its gates, and hymns of victory echoed across the Crusader camps. Yet disputes quickly followed, over prisoners, over spoils, over honor. The fragile alliance was strained further. Soon after, Philip II chose to return to France, leaving Richard as the leading figure of the crusade. From that point onward, the Lionheart stood at the center of the story, destined to face Saladin himself. In the autumn of 1191 came the Battle of Arsuf. Here, Richard and Saladin met in open combat. Chroniclers wrote that the clash of swords and the blast of trumpets rose so fiercely it seemed to shake the very sea. Richard led his heavy cavalry in a decisive charge, and the tide of knights shattered the enemy lines. Arsuf was a clear victory, and it proved Richard's skill as a commander equal to his reputation. Yet the road to Jerusalem remained difficult. Again and again, the Crusaders marched toward the Holy City, only to falter from lack of strength. Saladin's strategy was patient. He avoided decisive battles, harassed their supply lines, and wore them down with raids. Between the two leaders grew not only conflict, but respect. Richard and Saladin became rivals in arms and equals in reputation. Chroniclers tell that when Richard fell ill, Saladin sent him fresh fruit and cool water. This was a war fought not only with swords, but with gestures of honor. Still, despite victories, Jerusalem remained beyond reach. The Third Crusade became not only a story of battles, but of an encounter between two towering figures whose names would echo in history: Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. After the victories at Arsuf and other campaigns, the Crusaders once more approached Jerusalem. It was the heart of their mission, the city for which they had crossed seas and continents. From the hills they could see the holy city before them. Yet the strength for a decisive assault was lacking. The knights were exhausted. Supplies were dwindling, and the roads remained under constant watch by Saladin's forces. Richard the Lionheart understood clearly, even if he managed to take Jerusalem, he could not hold it. The city lay deep in Muslim lands, and any capture could turn into a trap. Saladin, for his part, avoided open battle but shadowed every move, ready to strike if the Crusaders overreached. And so began a period of negotiation. These talks carried as much tension as the battles themselves. Each side sought to gain time while preserving honor. Chroniclers tell us that Richard and Saladin never met face to face, yet messages and envoys passed continually between their camps. Legends even speak of Richard proposing a marriage alliance between his sister and Saladin's brother, a vision of peace that might have united two worlds. In 1192, an agreement was finally reached. Jerusalem remained under Muslim control, but Christian pilgrims were guaranteed safe access to the holy sites. The coastal cities from Jaffa to Acre remained in Crusader hands, securing a foothold in the Holy Land. The treaty was a compromise. To many in Europe it felt incomplete, for the holy city was not reclaimed. Yet for those who had endured the long campaign, peace brought relief. The armies could return home knowing that while Jerusalem was not theirs, pilgrims could once again pray within its walls. Richard the Lionheart set sail for the west. His name lived on in song and legend, his courage celebrated across Europe. Saladin, for his part, was remembered not only as a defender of Jerusalem, but also as a ruler who balanced strength with generosity toward his foes. Thus ended the Third Crusade. It did not restore the Holy City, yet it left behind a memory of two towering figures who met in battle and in honor. The story of this crusade reminds us that sometimes the greatest victory lies not in conquering a city, but in finding a fragile balance between war and peace. When the Third Crusade ended, Europe still remembered the names of Richard the Lionheart and Saladin. Yet despite their fame, the central goal had not been achieved. Jerusalem remained in Muslim hands. And so, at the dawn of the 13th century, the call went out once more. In 1202, Pope Innocent III proclaimed the Fourth Crusade. Its purpose was the same, to reclaim the Holy City. But from the very beginning, this crusade took another path. The army was to sail by sea, and for this the Crusaders made an agreement with Venice. The Republic promised ships for thousands of men, but the cost was high, too high. When the Crusaders gathered at the Venetian ports, it became clear that they could not pay the full price. The Venetians, masters of trade and cunning, offered a bargain. Instead of gold, they asked for service. The Crusaders would first capture the city of Zara on the Adriatic, a Christian city that had resisted Venetian control. And so the army, sworn to fight for Jerusalem, laid siege instead to a fellow Christian town. Its fall was the first sign that the crusade was straying from its course. The path then twisted further. In Byzantium, in mighty Constantinople, rival factions struggled for the throne. One claimant promised the Crusaders and Venetians vast rewards if they helped him seize power. Once again, the crusade turned aside, not toward Jerusalem, but toward the greatest Christian city of the East. In 1203, the Crusaders arrived before the walls of Constantinople. The sun gleamed on its massive fortifications, and golden domes crowned its churches. It was the largest city in Christendom, and now it became the target of those who had sworn to free the Holy Land. At first, they succeeded. Their ally took the throne, but soon as promises collapsed, money ran short, and unrest spread through the city. In 1204, the Crusaders attacked again. This time, they stormed Constantinople itself. For 3 days, the city was given over to plunder. Palaces and churches were looted, relics and icons carried west, libraries and homes set ablaze. It was a tragedy for Byzantium, and a deep wound for all of Christendom. Thus, the Fourth Crusade, launched to free Jerusalem, ended instead with the fall of Constantinople. In its place, the Latin Empire was founded, but it never held the power of Byzantium. The purity of the crusading ideal was broken, for the sword had turned not against unbelievers, but against fellow Christians. Europe gained treasures, Venice gained trade and power, but the Holy Land remained beyond reach. The Fourth Crusade left behind no triumph, only the bitter memory of betrayal. It became a symbol of how ambition and greed could turn a sacred cause into a tragedy. More than 2 decades had passed since the end of the Third Crusade. Jerusalem shifted hands at times, but in the end remained under Muslim control. In Europe, hope of reclaiming the Holy City still burned. At the Lateran Council of 1215, Pope Innocent III once again called upon Christendom to take the cross. Thus began the story of the Fifth Crusade. This time, the Crusaders turned their eyes not directly toward Jerusalem, but toward Egypt. In the medieval world, Egypt was the key to the East. Wealthy, populous, with a strong fleet and a powerful army. Whoever held Egypt could command the fate of the Holy Land. In 1217, the crusading armies set out. They were led by King Andrew II of Hungary, Duke Leopold VI of Austria, and later joined by other nobles. The force was large, yet from the very start its actions lacked unity. At first, they landed in Palestine and carried out a few raids, but the true target of the campaign lay further south, in Egypt. In 1218, the Crusaders marched into the Nile Delta and laid siege to the city of Damietta. This was a strategic port, a gateway to Egypt. The siege dragged on for over a year. Crusaders built towers and engines, fought against the blazing heat, against swarms of insects, and endured hunger and disease. Chroniclers wrote that the land around the city became a vast camp of banners, dust, and restless soldiers. At last, in 1219, Damietta fell. To Europe, this was a great triumph. Many believed the road to Cairo and all of Egypt now lay open. But here the Crusaders made a fatal mistake. Instead of securing their prize and negotiating peace, for the Sultan of Egypt even offered to return Jerusalem in exchange for Damietta, the Crusaders pressed onward into the heart of the land. In 1221, they marched upriver toward Cairo, but the Nile itself became their enemy. Fields were flooded, canals overflowed, and the army found itself trapped, cut off from supplies and retreat. Surrounded and starving, panic spread through the camp. At last, there was no choice but to surrender. The Crusaders gave up Damietta and withdrew from Egypt. Years of struggle had ended in failure. The Fifth Crusade left Europe disheartened. What had begun with promise and victory ended with bitter disappointment. It showed that even great triumphs could be lost without unity, foresight, and the wisdom to make peace at the right time. After the failure at Damietta, Europe once more turned its eyes to the east. Yet this time, events unfolded in a very different way. At the heart of the new crusade stood the figure of Frederick II Hohenstaufen, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, one of the most remarkable men of the Middle Ages. He spoke several languages, studied philosophy, science, and astronomy, and even admired aspects of Arab culture. His contemporaries called him the wonder of the world. Frederick had long promised the Pope that he would take the cross. Yet he delayed again and again, distracted by the affairs of Italy and Germany. For this, he was even excommunicated. Still, in 1228 he finally set out, leading not a vast host but a smaller, disciplined force. His path was not one of great battles, but of negotiation. Frederick understood that Jerusalem could not be held by force alone. Instead, he turned to diplomacy. At that time, the Sultan of Egypt, Al-Kamil, nephew of Saladin, faced troubles of his own, struggling against rivals within the Muslim world. This created an opening for compromise. In 1229, a treaty was signed between Frederick II and the Sultan. By its terms, several key territories were returned to the Christians, including Jerusalem itself. The Muslims retained control over the Temple Mount and their holiest sites, but the Christian shrines were once again open to pilgrims. It was an astonishing outcome. Jerusalem restored to Christian hands, not by the sword, but by the pen. Frederick entered the city without bloodshed. In the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, he placed a crown upon his own head. Yet the moment was strange and controversial. The emperor, still under excommunication, restored Christian rule in Jerusalem without the blessing of the church that had cast him out. The peace was fragile. In Europe, many criticized Frederick for the leniency of the agreement. Pope Gregory IX refused to recognize the treaty. In the Holy Land itself, some doubted whether the city could be defended, and indeed, within years, Jerusalem would again be threatened. Still, the Sixth Crusade remained unique. It showed that even in an age when the world was accustomed to solving disputes with war, Jerusalem could be won through words. After the fragile success of Frederick II, when Jerusalem was briefly restored to Christian hands through diplomacy, only a few decades passed before it was lost again. In 1244, the city was seized by the Khwarezmians, allies of Muslim rulers. Churches and holy places were ravaged, and for Europe this was yet another heavy blow. At that time, France was ruled by King Louis IX, later known as St. Louis. He was a deeply devout monarch, admired for his piety and his knightly virtues. The loss of Jerusalem struck him personally, and he took it as a challenge to all of Christendom. Louis resolved to lead a new crusade himself. In 1248, the French army set out for the east. Once again, the target was Egypt, the key to controlling the Holy Land. Louis believed that by conquering Cairo, he could bargain for the return of Jerusalem. In 1249, the Crusaders landed in Egypt and quickly captured the city of Damietta. It felt like a dazzling victory, even greater than before, for the city surrendered with little resistance. Europe rejoiced, and it seemed at last that the mistakes of the past might be avoided. But the same trap awaited them. Louis pressed onward toward Cairo, confident at first, but the Nile and its canals became their undoing. The Egyptian forces flooded the fields, and Crusaders found themselves trapped, unable to advance or retreat. In 1250 came the Battle of Almanzora, which ended in catastrophe. The Crusader army was shattered, and King Louis IX himself was taken captive. It was a shock across Europe. The mightiest monarch of Christendom in the hands of his enemies. A massive ransom was demanded, and in time Louis was released. Yet the campaign had collapsed. Damietta was surrendered, and Jerusalem remained beyond reach. Despite the failure, Louis did not lose faith. He stayed in the East for several years, strengthening the fragile Crusader states that still clung to the coast. His devotion and steadfastness made him a symbol of piety, and later the Church canonized him as a saint. The Seventh Crusade left behind a somber legacy. Vast resources have been spent, many lives lost, and even a king captured. It showed how difficult it had become for Europe to seize and hold the initiative. Yet it also proved that the idea of the Crusades still lived in the hearts of rulers and people alike. Years had passed since the defeat at Almanzora. King Louis IX had returned to France, yet his heart remained bound to the East. He believed deeply that the mission of the Crusades was not finished. In 1270, already in the later years of his life, he gathered an army once more. For him, it was a second campaign, but for Europe it became the last, the Eighth Crusade. This time, Louis chose a different path. Instead of striking directly at Jerusalem or Egypt, he turned his eyes toward North Africa, to Tunis, the ruler that was tied to the wider Muslim world, yet also maintained trade with Europe. Louis hoped that by seizing or subduing Tunis, he could create a new base of power, and perhaps even convert its emir to Christianity. In the summer of 1270, the crusading army landed on the hot shores of Africa. Camps stretched out across the sand, and ships lay anchored under the blazing sun. At first, all seemed promising. The Crusaders took several positions and secured their foothold along the coast. But soon they faced an enemy no sword could strike. Disease, epidemics of dysentery, and plague swept through the camp. Day by day the soldiers weakened, and the ranks of the army thinned. Among the sick was the king himself. Louis IX lay in his tent, praying and receiving the sacraments. In August 1270, he died in Tunis. His passing marked the symbolic end of the entire crusading movement. Leaderless, the army made peace and sailed home. The Eighth Crusade brought no victories, no conquests. It left only the memory of an old king's devotion, of a monarch who held fast his faith and mission until his last breath. For Europe, his death was a wound, yet also became a source of reverence. Louis was canonized as a saint, remembered as one of the purest idealists of his time. With his death, the era of the Great Crusades came to a close. For nearly 2 centuries, they had filled the world with both triumph and tragedy, reshaping relations between East and West. From Jerusalem to Constantinople, from Cairo to Tunis, the Crusades left behind a legacy of faith, conflict, and legend, one that would echo for generations to come. The Crusades lasted for nearly 2 centuries. They began in 1096, when crowds of pilgrims and knights set out for Jerusalem, and ended in 1270, when the aged King Louis IX died far away in Tunis. In that span of time, the world was transformed. The Crusades brought Europe new knowledge, new goods, and new connections. Through them, the West discovered spices, silks, medicines, and ideas from the East. Cities gained new crafts and sciences, while trade and seafaring grew stronger. Venice and Genoa grew wealthy, their ships carrying not only warriors but commerce across the seas. Yet the Crusades also brought sorrow. They left behind wars, destruction, and suffering. Jerusalem, Antioch, Constantinople, and Cairo saw fire and blood, while the peoples of East and West carried memories of wounds and grievances for generations. For Europe, it was an age of faith and fanaticism, of courage and cruelty. For the East, it was a time of trial and resistance. And for the wider world, it was a meeting of civilizations, one shaped as much by conflict and misunderstanding as by exchange and learning. Looking back across those 2 centuries, we see not only wars and defeats, but a story of human passion, of fear and hope, of longing for meaning, and of the dream of the holy. And though Jerusalem never remained in Crusader hands, the very idea of the Crusades forever changed both Europe and the Middle East. The Crusades remain in memory as one of history's great dramas, filled with heroes and betrayals, with the light of faith and the shadow of greed. Their age has ended, but their lessons endure.